Welcome to the Restricted Handling Daily Intel Brief. Let's dig in. Here's what's been going on in Russia in the last 24 hours. President Donald Trump has been in direct calls with both Vladimir Putin and Volodymyr Zelenskyy. The timing matters here. These conversations landed right around US Independence Day, and they immediately set off a wave of competing narratives. From Moscow's perspective, the messaging out of Putin's camp is all about momentum. They're framing Russia as advancing across multiple fronts and suggesting Ukraine is misreading the situation. From Kyiv's side, Zelenskyy is pushing the opposite direction, emphasizing urgency and the need for stronger US and NATO backing, especially in air defense. There's also a senior US official describing the battlefield as largely frozen, which tells you where Washington's internal read is sitting right now. Not collapse, not breakthrough, but grind. Now, layered on top of that is something classic Kremlin information strategy. The focus on Kostyantynivka in eastern Ukraine is doing a lot of heavy lifting in Russian messaging right now. Russian officials are publicly claiming the city has been seized, presenting it as a key step toward full control of Donetsk. But on the ground, Ukrainian reporting and even some Russian-linked sources are telling a more complicated story. Russian forces are in parts of the city, yes, but they have not consolidated control. Think infiltration, not occupation. Small groups, not territorial dominance. What matters here is not just the battlefield reality, but the narrative being built around it. Moscow is essentially trying to create a perception of inevitability. The idea is simple. If Russia looks like it is steadily taking ground, then the political pressure shifts toward accepting Russian terms at the negotiation table, even if the actual map is far messier. That ties directly into the next piece, which is Russia's short-term ceasefire proposal around Kostyantynivka. Moscow proposed a very limited pause, officially framed around humanitarian movement and the recovery of bodies. On paper, that sounds structured and controlled. In practice, it's happening in an area where control is still contested. That disconnect is important. Analysts assess this kind of localized ceasefire as less about humanitarian coordination and more about shaping perception and potentially creating operational breathing space. Ukraine, predictably, is not aligned with the proposal, and Russia is already signaling rejection in advance as part of the information cycle. Zooming out, Ukraine is running its own major strategic campaign in Crimea, and this is where things get interesting. Crimea is no longer just a symbolic or secondary theater. It is becoming a sustained pressure point. Ukrainian forces have been systematically targeting Russian air defense systems, radar sites, bridges, rail links, fuel infrastructure, and electrical grids across the peninsula. The logic is layered. First, degrade the air defense umbrella so Russian systems can't fully track or intercept incoming threats. Second, hit logistics so movement across the peninsula becomes slower and more exposed. Third, disrupt energy and fuel so the local system starts to strain under its own weight. The result is not just military disruption, but a creeping administrative and civilian pressure problem for Russian occupation authorities. Blackouts, fuel shortages, and transport disruptions are becoming recurring features rather than isolated incidents. And once Crimea starts absorbing that level of sustained pressure, it bleeds into something bigger: Russia's broader rear infrastructure problem. Across Russia itself, Ukrainian long-range strikes are increasingly focused on energy and logistics nodes. Ports on the Baltic Sea, refinery infrastructure deeper inside Russia, and transport hubs tied to energy exports have all come under pressure. Facilities linked to major export corridors are being disrupted, and there are early signs of knock-on effects in fuel availability and distribution. You are also seeing Russia lean more heavily on external support, including increased fuel flows from Belarus, which is a quiet but important signal of strain inside the system. So while frontline movement is relatively static in many areas, the rear is becoming more active and arguably more strategically important. Now, shifting to NATO and force posture signaling, there was a notable maritime incident in the high north involving a Russian reconnaissance aircraft approaching a UK carrier strike group operating under NATO command. The aircraft came in close enough that British F-35s had to intercept and escort it away. The UK called the behavior unsafe and unprofessional. This is part of a familiar pattern. probing NATO naval formations, testing response times, and collecting intelligence on operational behavior. It's not new, but the timing matters given the NATO summit and rising tension in parallel theaters. On the information front inside Russia, there is also a tightening of narrative control. Reporting indicates Russian authorities have instructed domestic media to reduce or avoid publishing visual evidence of Ukrainian strikes on Russian territory while amplifying Russian strike success stories. That tells you something important. The informational asymmetry is becoming harder to manage internally. At the same time, Russian-linked messaging is pushing historical and political narratives aimed at driving wedges between European states, particularly between Poland and Ukraine. These are long-tail influence operations designed to create friction inside the broader Western coalition. Ukraine, meanwhile, is doing something strategically significant that often gets overlooked. It is exporting its drone warfare ecosystem. Kyiv has signed multiple defense cooperation arrangements with NATO members and partners in the Middle East, not just for equipment, but for training, systems integration, and operational doctrine. Countries like Latvia, Lithuania, and several Gulf states are engaging with Ukraine based on its real-world experience countering Iranian-style drones and Russian strike patterns. That shift matters. Ukraine is moving from being primarily a recipient of military aid to a provider of operational expertise in one of the fastest evolving domains of modern warfare. Now, briefly on the kinetic layer, just to anchor the strategic picture. Russia conducted another large-scale missile and drone strike on Kyiv, involving dozens of missiles and hundreds of drones. Ukrainian air defenses intercepted the majority of aerial drones and cruise missiles, but ballistic systems largely penetrated defenses, underscoring a persistent vulnerability in high-end interception capacity. The strike caused civilian casualties and infrastructure damage, but more importantly, it reinforces the broader pattern. Russia is using massed air campaigns to apply psychological and political pressure at key diplomatic moments, especially around NATO engagement. Finally, zoom out to the China-Russia military dimension. The Joint Sea 2026 exercises are underway in the Yellow Sea, with a heavy emphasis on unmanned systems. That includes drone aircraft, naval drones, and counter-drone scenarios. This is not just routine cooperation. It reflects a shared recognition that unmanned systems are now central to naval warfare, air defense, and maritime domain awareness. The Russian cruiser Varyag and multiple Chinese destroyers and submarines are participating, but the real focus is doctrinal: how to operate, fight, and defend against autonomous systems at scale. Thanks for listening. We're building something special here, and you're part of it. If you haven't yet, leaving a review or a quick comment goes a long way in helping others find the show. And if you want to go deeper, we publish a daily intel brief on Substack at restrictedhandling.substack.com, covering Russia, China, Iran, the Middle East, and the DPRK in more detail. Take care and have a great week.